If you want it so bad, old woman, eat it from the floor.
My 75th birthday was supposed to be a quiet surrender. Not to old age, but to peace. I hadn't asked for a party, just a moment. A simple, small gathering with the family I had spent a lifetime building. I bought the cake myself, a vanilla round with white frosting. It wasn't about the expense, which was little enough for my meager pension, but about the gesture. 75 years on this earth, and all I wanted was to sit at a table, surrounded by the faces of my children and grandchildren, blow out 7 candles, and hear a few quiet, sincere words of love. I pressed my best dress, the one my late husband, Arthur, had always loved. The soft blue made my eyes look less tired, he'd said. Carrying that cake across town felt like carrying my last piece of hope. It was balanced precariously, its white icing surface trembling with every step, like a small, fragile monument to my history. I walked to my eldest son, David's house, a house I had paid the initial down payment on and had quietly settled the remaining mortgage for after their last business failure. I expected smiles. I expected hugs. Instead, I found a loud, thundering party. David's friends, young, loud, and successful, filled the room. Music pulsed from massive speakers, the bass shaking the very floorboards. Beer bottles clinked and laughter roared, a harsh, transactional kind of laughter that had nothing to do with family. David saw me, standing in the doorway, my spine straight, holding that little white cake like an offering to a hostile god. His eyes didn't widen in surprise, they rolled in open annoyance. "Mother," he said, his voice loud and rough with impatience, the words stripped of any warmth. "You didn't need to come. We're busy." I smiled anyway. I couldn't stop myself. It was my birthday, after all, and I was Eleanor, the matriarch, the one who fixed things. "I just wanted to spend it with my family, David," I said, stepping carefully into the room. Only a moment. A few people turned, curious, confused faces looking from me to the cake in my hands. David's face was a mask of shame, not for his rudeness, but for the attention I was drawing away from him. I placed the cake on a small table near the wall. It looked tiny, almost pathetic, next to the towering bottles of imported liquor. 7 small, colorful candles stood ready. With hands that only betrayed a slight tremble, I had written my own name on the frosting. "Happy birthday, Eleanor." My grandchildren, Sarah, Michael, and little Emily, stared at the cake, whispering behind their hands. My daughter-in-law, Clara, busied herself with guests, refusing to meet my eyes. Then David laughed, a loud, booming, drunken laugh that sliced through the music. "You bought your own cake, Mom?" he asked, making sure his friends and everyone else in the room heard the pathetic punchline. Laughter ripped through the crowd, shallow, immediate, and utterly dismissive. I felt the heat of it crawl over my skin. Not anger, but a profound, cold humiliation. "I didn't want to trouble anyone," I said softly, my voice barely above a whisper. He came closer, towering over my 5'3" frame, that cruel, entitled grin stretching across his face. "You really shouldn't have," he said, and then it happened. Before I could even blink, his large, careless hands reached out. He scooped up the little vanilla cake, 2 hands, a gesture of almost comical disregard, and with a grunt of disdain he threw it down on the floor. The sound was a wet, sickening thud. Frosting exploded outwards, splattering across my new blue dress and my sensible leather shoes. The candles flew from the center, one still sputtering on its side like a tiny, defiant star in a field of shame. The scent of vanilla and sugar, once a promise of sweetness, now reeked of rot. The room erupted. This was not the polite chuckle of a crowded party. This was full-throated, deep, cruel, drunk laughter. Someone even clapped, a sharp, singular sound that was meant to crush me entirely. I stood there, frozen. My mind went utterly blank. There was no pain, no fury, just a terrifying, icy clarity. I looked down at the mess, the smashed cake, the splattering candles. Then I looked up at David, my eldest, the son whose hands I had once taught to tie his own shoes. He was looking down at me as if I were a piece of trash to be swept up. His voice cut through the noise, slicing away the last remnants of my dignity. "If you want it so bad, old woman, eat it from the floor." More laughter followed. It was the deepest cut. The moment they all chose him over me. My daughter-in-law giggled, covering her mouth with one hand. My grandchildren lowered their eyes, their silence a chilling form of agreement. My knees wobbled, but I did not fall. I did not speak. I did not cry. My heart, which had been racing a moment before, now beat with a slow, heavy, relentless rhythm. I simply looked at him, looked at the mocking faces, looked at the vanilla stain on the expensive hardwood floor. And in that terrifying, silent second, I made the only decision a woman of my years and my history could make. I nodded. A single, small, deliberate nod. I turned around, slowly, carefully, and walked out of that house. The thundering music, the cruel laughter, it all faded behind me, sounding distant and meaningless. The cold night air hit my face like water after fire. I walked home alone under the streetlights, my new blue dress speckled with white frosting. Each flicker of the streetlights seemed to look away, unwilling to witness my shame. When I reached my empty house, the silence was almost merciful. I sat at my kitchen table, the sticky remnants of their cruelty still clinging to my shoes, and I thought. I thought about the college tuition I'd paid, the loans I'd covered, the second chances I'd given, the foundation of every single success they had ever claimed. I had built their world, piece by piece, dollar by dollar, and now I knew what they had done with it. They had weaponized it against me. I found the one candle that hadn't been completely destroyed, a small stub of wax with a wick, still carrying the scent of vanilla. I set it on a saucer and lit it. The tiny flame threw dancing shadows against the quiet walls. And to the ghost of my husband, to the memory of the young mother I once was, and to the woman who sat alone at 75, I whispered a single promise as final as a closing door. You will never humiliate me again. You will never, ever mistake my kindness for weakness. They had tried to crush me. They did not know that I still kept the papers and the keys, the final documents that mattered. By the next morning, something happened that would shock them all, a quiet force of correction that would rewrite their comfortable lives entirely. The laughter didn't fade with the night, it stayed in the bones. I could still hear it even before I fully opened my eyes, a sound that settled deep in the marrow, refusing to be washed away by sleep. People say humiliation passes, but they are wrong. It lingers, sharp and metallic, like a smell you can't scrub from your skin. I sat at the kitchen table, staring at the single, scorched candle stub I'd rescued from the cake. Its wax had hardened overnight, and I knew something inside me had done the same. That night, when David threw the cake, I saw more than just his cruelty. Every guest who laughed, every grandchild who smirked, every neighbor I'd helped who pretended not to see, they all showed me exactly who they were. I wasn't their mother or grandmother anymore. I was entertainment, the old woman who had outlived her usefulness, the relic who hadn't known when to stop showing up. The floor of David's expensive home had been sticky with sugar and my shame. For a fleeting moment, a ghost of an old thought whispered that perhaps I deserved it. That's what years of endless giving without thanks does to you. It trains you to accept disrespect as if it were a twisted form of love. But as I watched the tiny candle die out on the saucer, the warmth in my heart went cold, replaced by a crystalline stillness. Not broken. Still, like ice forming where a nurturing warmth used to be. I remembered my walk home through the dark streets. I had passed the bakery where I'd bought the cake. Mr. Chin, the kind baker who had once given David free pastries as a boy, waved from inside his glowing shop. I hadn't waved back. I just kept walking. I sat in the dark for hours that night, listening only to the wall clock's steady tick-tock, letting every single second of my humiliation burn itself into my memory. I thought of Arthur, my late husband, He had warned me years ago. "You give them too much, Eleanor," he'd said, his voice laced with concern. "One day they'll forget who gave it to them entirely." I dismissed him then, thinking him too cautious, too protective. But Arthur had seen the quiet rot that grows in ungrateful hearts, a rot I had been too busy excusing to notice. At dawn, I walked to the mirror. The woman staring back looked older than 75. Her face was lined with decades of sacrifice, but her eyes, though dull, were steady. I whispered to her reflection, "Enough." It wasn't loud or dramatic, it was final. Later that day, I walked to the park, the same one where I used to push my children on the swings. I sat on a wet bench, watching the pigeons peck at crumbs, thinking about the boy David once was, holding my hand and begging, "Don't let go, Mom." Somewhere along the way, he had. By evening, the hot flush of anger had cooled into a sharp, clear understanding. Humiliation is only permanent if you let it be. My whole life, I had built things, a home, a family, a business, and futures. And in the end, all that work, the true wealth, still fundamentally belonged to me. Their laughter hadn't destroyed me. It had merely reminded me of what I still controlled. I went home, opened the bottom drawer of Arthur's old mahogany desk, and pulled out an antique binder. It contained the real treasures: deeds, account papers, investment documents, and share certificates. My signature was still on every crucial line. My authority still carried the final, definitive weight. David and his siblings had mocked me for being old, but they hadn't understood that age doesn't erase ownership, it protects it. I ran my fingers over the papers, each one a quiet, unassailable weapon of truth. They thought I was powerless, a silly old woman who would be forced to eat cake off the floor and bow her head in defeat. They had no idea that in humiliating me, they had signed the irrevocable end of their own comfort. I closed the binder gently, and, for the first time since my birthday, a small, tight smile touched my lips. Tomorrow, the world might still pity me, but the day after, the whispers would stop, because silence, when it finally moves, doesn't warn you. It simply, quietly destroys. The following night, the silence of my home became my only companion. No phone calls, no forced apologies, not a single text message. They had committed an act of open contempt and simply carried on as if nothing had happened. To them, it was just a joke, a moment of drunken laughter already forgotten. To me, it was the night something sacred died. I had forgiven their laziness, their greed, their years of indifference, but this was different. This was contempt. And once a mother sees contempt in her child's eyes, a piece of her heart hardens forever. On the third morning, I dressed slowly, meticulously, pressed my best shirt, brushed my hair, and looked at the man in the mirror. No, I mean the woman. The woman who was awake. For 75 years, I had lived as if I had to prove my worth. Now, I didn't need to prove anything. I only needed to remember. I went through the old drawers, the boxes, the filing cabinets. Every piece of paper told the same story: bank accounts, property deeds, business shares. Years ago, I had signed everything over to them, or so they thought, because I trusted them. But they had made a fatal mistake. They never checked how much ultimate power I had retained. They never bothered to understand that some things don't fully transfer until the person who built them is utterly gone. I flipped through the documents for hours, sipping my tea, my hand steady now, moving across decades of ink and misplaced trust. Every clause, every line, every initial led to one chilling conclusion. The empire of their comfort still answered to me. That realization brought a profound peace, not rage. I didn't curse their names. I didn't shout. I simply smiled, because power doesn't always look like youth or noise. Sometimes it looks like an old woman with a pen and a perfectly clear mind. That night, I slept soundly for the first time in years. No dreams, no echoing laughter, just a deep, resolute calm. By the next morning, I had a plan. Not to punish them. Punishment is too brief. I wanted balance. They had taken my dignity in front of strangers. I would take their comfort in front of the world. The silence that followed my humiliation had become my greatest weapon. While they laughed, I had listened. While they mocked, I had prepared. They didn't know it yet, but the woman they told to eat from the floor had spent her entire life building a kingdom that could crumble in a single day. And now I was ready to choose. When dawn arrived, the decision was already a cold, hard fact. There was no remnant of the blinding rage that had first gripped me. No tremor in my hands, no heat in my chest. Only a stillness so sharp it felt like it could cut glass. That is how you know a woman means every word. When she stopped shaking, I poured myself a cup of black coffee, sat at Arthur's old desk, and looked at the pile of documents I had meticulously organized through the night. For years, I had signed my children's comfort into existence. Business shares, house titles, joint savings accounts, properties bought in my name and gifted to them. They were so blinded by their own self-importance, they truly believed the world belonged to them. They never knew every crucial thread still ran back to my hand. It's funny how arrogance blinds the young. They look at an old woman and see weakness. They see silence and assume surrender. They never realize that age doesn't soften power, it makes it precise. Every deal they ever flaunted, every house they drove up to, every car they bragged about, it all came from my years of effort. My name sat quietly on every piece of paper, a ghost signature waiting for its moment. And now it was here. I had given them everything once. Now I would take it all back. I called the bank first. Mr. Harrison, the branch manager, knew me well. We'd met every month for 4 decades. "Mrs. Hanley," he said warmly, "I thought you'd finally retired from all this paperwork." I smiled into the phone. "I did, Mr. Harrison, but my children apparently haven't." He went silent for a beat, then asked softly, "Do you want the transfers reversed?" "All of them," I said. "Every joint account, every signature, every fund transfer. Move the total assets into my private ledger, effective immediately." There was that characteristic pause, the kind that tells you the man on the other end understands the monumental weight of what is being asked. Then he simply said, "It will be done by morning, Mrs. Hanley. The secondary holders will be notified." "No," I corrected, my voice firm. "Let them find out the hard way." Next came the properties, 9 of them in total, scattered across the city and the coast. Some were nominally under their names, but many were held in trusts I had quietly built decades ago, each one layered with clauses they had never bothered to read. Clauses that kept final, dispositive ownership under my authority until my death. And since I was clearly still breathing, I decided it was time to breathe a little life back into my control. I called my property lawyer, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Ms. Chin. "Activate every clause in the Hanley family trusts," I instructed. "List all properties for immediate sale." She hesitated. "All of them, Eleanor? The beach cottage, too?" "All," I repeated. "No exceptions. Use your private buyer's list. I want fast transactions and no media attention. The paperwork must be cleaner than a surgeon's knife." While the world woke to routine, my counter-empire began to move, quietly, invisibly. Account balances realigned. Deeds shifted. Emails were sent between layers of legal and financial institutions. What my children didn't know was that power doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers through secure phone lines, glides through ink, and completely rewrites entire futures before breakfast. By noon, the process was mostly complete. Funds, deeds, control of the small family businesses, even the vacation property they bragged about on social media. All of it now rested where it belonged, squarely in my hands. I didn't smile. I didn't gloat. I just sat back, folded my hands, and looked out the kitchen window. The sky was the same pale gray as the vanilla frosting that had once splattered across my sensible shoes. The humiliation they had inflicted on me had been transformed into something precise, something clean, a kind of justice only the patient truly understand. That evening, I wrote a letter, not to them, but to myself. I sealed it and placed it in the drawer beside Arthur's photograph. She had always said I was too forgiving. I used to tell him that forgiveness made me strong. Now I realized she was right. Forgiveness only makes you soft to people who sharpen their cruelty against it. Outside, the streetlights flickered to life. I poured myself another cup of coffee, black, and waited. I knew exactly what tomorrow would bring. Panic, confusion, and raw fear. They would check their phones, open their accounts, and discover that everything they once mocked me for owning had vanished into thin air. It wasn't revenge. It was correction. And when you spend a lifetime building something for others, you earn the right to decide who truly deserves to keep it. The quiet hand of paper is the deadliest weapon a betrayed grandmother can wield. And by sunrise, that hand had finished writing the final chapter of their comfort. The morning they woke up was the morning their world turned upside down, though I can only imagine the unfolding chaos. I didn't need to be there to witness it. I had written the script, and they unwittingly were forced to perform it. It would have started subtly, one by one in their separate, expensive homes, the ones I'd quietly secured for them. They would reach for their phones with the same easy arrogance they'd worn all their lives. They would have been expecting the usual notifications: business updates, credit alerts, reminders of tea times. Instead, what they found were digital warnings. Transaction denied. Account restricted. Insufficient balance. The screens that usually showed comforting numbers now simply reflected back their growing panic. David, my eldest, was likely the first. He always prided himself on his early rising and discipline. But discipline can't fund an empty account. He would have called the bank in a controlled, furious tone. "There must be some mistake," I could hear him saying, his voice sharp with entitlement. "This is my account." The bank clerk, polite but firm, would have given the only answer possible. "I'm sorry, sir. The account has been moved to the primary holder. Your access has been deactivated." Silence would follow, the kind that only descends when a man realizes he's been dethroned without a battle. The others would have woken soon after. Panic spreads faster than any rumor in a family built on shared greed. Calls would have flown between them before breakfast. "Are your funds showing? Did you authorize anything? Check the deeds. Check the house." Confusion rapidly curdled into fury. My son Michael would have tried to log into the shared business portal, only to find his access key revoked. My daughter-in-law, Clara, probably screamed when she saw the mortgage notice had changed hands overnight, complete with the stamp of the new owner and an official eviction date. The property was sold. Signatures verified. All perfectly legal. They could shout. They could curse. But the law, I knew, has no sympathy for arrogance. I wasn't there, but I knew exactly how it played out. I had built every foundation, written every clause. Their downfall was choreographed like a symphony of quiet ruin, and the conductor, me, didn't need to lift a hand. They must have eventually gathered at David's house, faces pale, their expensive clothes wrinkled, all talking at once, frantically pointing fingers. "You said you handled the paperwork. You told me we owned it. How could this happen?" Somewhere in the middle of that chaos, one of them, perhaps my youngest, would whisper my name. The room would go silent. Then, slowly, the terrifying realization would settle over them like a thick, cold layer of ash. The old woman they mocked, the one they made crawl through humiliation, had done this. I wondered how that realization felt. The moment they understood I hadn't been powerless, just incredibly patient. They had always assumed wealth was permanent. They had believed their comfort was earned. But they had forgotten one fundamental truth. Nothing built on disrespect survives. By mid-afternoon, my phone started ringing. It was a relentless, demanding chorus of calls. I didn't answer. I watched the screen light up again and again. David, Michael, Clara, Sarah, each name flashing like a ghost from a life I no longer recognized. I poured myself a fresh cup of tea, settled into my favorite armchair, and let it ring. Their panic was a specific kind of music. the exact same pitch as their laughter that night, only reversed. Soon enough, they arrived at my doorstep. All of them, the same children and in-laws who had stood around that cake laughing. Only now their laughter was gone. Their suits looked tired. Their eyes were hollowed out by raw disbelief. I could see the cold, desperate fear in their posture, the kind that comes when entitled people realize the person they mocked has completely rewritten their world without raising her voice. They pounded on the door, shouting, pleading, "Mom, please open up. This has gone too far." But I stayed seated by the window, utterly calm, watching the afternoon light fade. I didn't need to see them. I wanted them to feel what I had felt, the utter, desolate silence after humiliation, the cold, crushing reality of being ignored by the person you had relied upon. When the knocking finally subsided, replaced by a desperate, ragged silence, I knew the lesson had landed. Their comfortable world was gone. Their pride was stripped, and all I had done was make a few keys and a few calls. The same hands they had once mocked for shaking had written their conclusion. They woke as kings and queens. By sunset they were beggars, and I hadn't lifted a single finger in anger. It didn't take long for them to find me again. By the third day following the Hanley reversal, all 9 of my children and in-laws stood outside my gate. They were stripped of everything they had once thought untouchable. Their luxury cars were gone, their fine suits replaced with yesterday's wrinkled shirts. The arrogant spark had left their eyes. What replaced it was something far quieter and more chilling: desperation. The same voices that once barked commands and laughed with drunken abandon now trembled like the cold wind. I watched them through the sheer curtains of the window, sipping my tea. I had imagined this moment so many times, not with rage, but with meticulous, glacial patience. And now it was here. They knocked timidly at first, then louder, a frantic, ragged rhythm. "Mom," David called, his voice rough and laced with panic. "Please, just talk to us." I didn't answer. They kept shouting my name, their words tripping over a sudden, unwelcome acquaintance with guilt. When my youngest son, Michael, finally choked out, "We're sorry," I felt a faint, sad awareness. That word, sorry, had never sounded so fragile, so utterly hollow. I stood up, straightened the collar of my dress, and walked slowly to the door. The hinges creaked as I opened it, a deliberate, slow movement, letting them see me, calm, steady, and terrifyingly alive. They froze. For a moment, no one spoke. It was like seeing ghosts, only I was the ghost they couldn't bury. David, red-eyed and pale, stepped forward. "Mother, please," he pleaded, his voice cracking. "You've made your point. We've lost everything. The businesses, the houses, the accounts. It's all gone. But you don't have to do this. We're still your children." I looked at him, then at the huddle of my family. 9 people I had once carried on my shoulders, now standing on my porch like utterly defeated strangers. "Children," I said, quietly, letting the word hang in the air. "You remember that word now." One of them started to speak, but I raised my hand, and the sound died immediately. I had their attention now, fully and completely. "You laughed while I stood in the middle of that room, covered in cake," I stated, my voice low and even, devoid of any discernible emotion. "You told me to eat it off the floor in front of my grandchildren, in front of strangers. You turned my birthday into a mockery. That night, you buried what little respect I had left. And now you come to me, crying because your gold has turned to dust." They stared at the ground. No one dared to meet my gaze. Michael wiped his face with the back of his hand. "We didn't mean it like that, Mom," he mumbled. I nodded slowly. "No, you meant it worse." The angriest of my in-laws, Clara's husband, suddenly snapped, his voice rising in petulant defiance. "So this is your revenge? You think taking everything makes you better than us?" I looked him dead in the eye. "No," I replied instantly. "It makes me even." The silence that followed was heavier than any argument. The truth had landed. I stepped aside and pointed to the ground in front of my porch, the same spot where I had wiped the vanilla frosting from my shoes. "Do you see that stain?" I asked. "That's where you told me to kneel. That's where you told me to eat what was left of my pride. So tell me, my children, why should I feed your pride now?" None of them spoke. Some turned away, unable to bear the weight of the memory. Others began to weep quietly. I sighed, feeling a weariness that was deeper than anger. "I didn't do this to destroy you," I said softly, allowing a sliver of my old maternal tone to surface. "I did it to remind you. Everything you owned was built by these hands, the same hands you mocked for shaking. You forgot who built your comfort. You forgot what respect looks like. So I took it away so you could remember." They begged then, quietly, brokenly, asking for forgiveness, asking for mercy. But mercy without respect is wasted. I handed each of them a plain, white envelope. "These are your futures," I said. "Inside, there's nothing but a list of what you lost. Read it and understand what it means to earn it back." David, the eldest, opened his envelope and froze. Inside, a single sentence was printed on the page. "You will never know hunger if you learn humility." I turned, walked back inside my quiet house, and closed the door with a gentle but definitive click. Through the wood, I could hear their confused sobs and the rustle of paper. I didn't feel pride. I just felt done. It had taken a lifetime to reach this silence, and now that it had arrived, it didn't feel like victory. It felt like closure. I had nothing left to say, nothing left to prove. That night, the house was silent, the kind of quiet that feels absolute and final. I sat in my chair by the window, watching the city lights flicker across the sleeping town. I could still faintly hear the echoes of their voices from earlier, the pleading, the disbelief, the shame. It had taken a lifetime to reach this point of stillness. I had nothing left to say, nothing left to prove. I'd watched their arrogance rot from the inside. I'd watched their laughter turn to panic. I'd watched the same men who once mocked me now beg for crumbs of mercy. But mercy had been spent years ago when I forgave their small cruelties, their forgotten birthdays, their careless words. What they did with that cake wasn't the beginning. It was the last, definitive straw on decades of quiet disrespect. And now, every account, every key, every title had been reset to zero. Not by rage, but by law. After the confrontation, I packed a small, practical suitcase, a few clothes, my old watch, and a single photograph of Arthur smiling. He was the only person who had ever truly seen me. He had always said, "If they forget what you gave them, one day you must remind them." I had kept that promise. Now it was time to leave. Before sunrise, I stood at the door of the house. I took one last look around. The chair by the window, the faint smell of old wood and tea, the walls that had borne witness to every argument and every silence. I locked the door, placed the key under the welcome mat, and walked down the steps. The air was cold and clean, the kind of morning that felt like a forgiveness I was finally extending to myself. A taxi waited by the gate. The driver, a kind young man, helped me with my small bag. "Where to, ma'am?" he asked. "Anywhere quiet," I said. "Up north, by the sea." He nodded, and the car rolled forward. The road curved through the sleeping town, past the dark bakery where my story had begun, where I'd once bought a cake for sons who would later throw it away. The shop sign glowed faintly in the dawn. I smiled faintly. The past had a strange way of looping back, but this time it couldn't touch me. I didn't leave a note. I didn't want them to find me. They didn't deserve to. I had arranged for my small pension to be forwarded to a quiet cabin up north, far from the noise of inheritance and ego. I would spend whatever time I had left walking along the shore, feeding the birds, and watching the tide wash away footprints, just as time had finally washed away their laughter. By the time the sun fully rose, I was miles away. The city behind me looked small, like a painting of another woman's life. In a way, it was The mother who tolerated everything, who swallowed humiliation and called it peace. She had died the night they threw that cake. The woman who remained was quieter, colder, and finally free. I imagined their faces when they realized I was gone. The empty house, the locked gate, the profound silence that would follow. Maybe they'd think I was dead. Maybe they would finally understand what it means to lose the person who carried you. Not financially, but morally. I didn't wish them harm. I wished them awareness. As the train carried me further away, I opened my small notebook and wrote one final thought. They took my kindness for weakness, my patience for permission, and my silence for surrender. So I left them with nothing, not to punish, but to teach. Outside, the sun was warm and indifferent. For the first time in years, I didn't flinch from the light. It's strange how quiet a true reckoning can be. No shouting, no public scene, no police at the door. Just silence, clean, deliberate, and final. I used to believe that love meant forgiveness. I used to believe that age meant I had to endure. But I learned there is a difference between forgiveness and permission. And I had given them permission to humiliate me for far too long. Sometimes, in the quiet of the evening in my new cabin, I wonder if they remember that night. The way the frosting splattered. The way they laughed as if I were a joke. I can still see the candles flickering on the ground like little dying stars. That image burned behind my eyes until I learned to turn that humiliation into focus. And when focus turns cold, it becomes power. I don't have much now. A cabin, a chair, and my dignity. But dignity is worth more than every dollar they ever took for granted. People say revenge doesn't heal. Maybe they are right. But it cleans. It clears the rot from the corners of your heart. It makes room for peace. I didn't ruin their lives. I only returned what was already theirs. Their greed, their disrespect, their blindness. I simply wrapped it all together and handed it back. And for the first time, they had to live with what they built. I think about Arthur. I think he would have smiled that quiet, knowing smile of his and whispered, "You finally remembered who you are, Eleanor." For a long time, I forgot. I let motherhood turn me into a servant. But I was never weak. I was patient, and patience, when finally used, is unstoppable. My children learned too late that power is not in the shout. It's in the silence before the storm. They threw my cake on the floor and told me to eat it. I didn't. I left it there for them to step on. And now, every step they take echoes with that same crunch. They made my birthday a joke. I made their legacy a lesson. They laughed at my age. Now time itself laughs at them.